It's time to start the open discussion space of our Boredom conference. Mario and I thought about this occasion as one for sharing our concerns and our thoughts about the fate of boredom studies and to bring back some questions by the attendees for our speakers. So before starting, we want to thank you all, because this is probably the last opportunity to do it if you are not going to join the presentation of the International Society of Boredom Studies. So we want to thank you all for your participation and for having made this encounter possible despite the odd circumstances. We received more than 50 proposals and selected 28 of them. And we also invited 4 keynotes, to which we are truly thankful. As a curiosity, our speakers, as you have seen during these 3 days, we're presenting for almost each corner of the world, with an important participation from the US, Poland, and Spain, as expected, I guess. We counted on several topics related to boredom and specialists from very different disciplines, which should make us think a little bit, I guess, on the multidisciplinarity of boredom studies. And well, participation was more or less balanced among men and women. So now I don't want to steal you more time to your discussion, so we can start with some of the unanswered questions of these 3 days. So Marius, please.
Yes, please go to another. This was my question to philosophers in general, maybe. Yeah, because I have this idea that maybe philosophy as a foundation of all sciences, practically, maybe this is not about astonishment, the foundation of philosophy, but the boredom is somehow involved in the foundation of science in general. This is my question to philosophers, but maybe all of you want to somehow talk about this.
I mean, I don't want to pretend that I'm talking on behalf of philosophers, so let's put that aside. I'm not. One of the issues, I suppose, is that difficulty with me is finding exactly what the epistemic value is in boredom. So with wonder, so Aristotle starts metaphysics by saying, you know, all humans by nature wonder, or something like that. I don't remember the exact Greek line. And you might think that wonder has it pushes you towards knowledge, a desire to know, to discover, whereas boredom, it can push me to eating more M&Ms or watching Netflix or doing something else. I think there's a broader, you know, one way of answering this question is it's kind of the panoply of responses to boredom. There are more. Whereas there might be more specific responses to wonder or awe. Yeah, that's my take. But great question. Really fascinating.
Oh, because I thought that maybe it somehow fits your idea that the boredom is functional and boredom is this signal for change. So maybe have been relevant not only for modernity, but I suppose philosophers said that this is ultimately and general human experience. So maybe this is not just modernity. Yes, John?
So I'll follow-up question here for Andreas and others. I mean, so, you know, when I saw your question, I sort of interpreted it in a slightly different way. So when you think about Kierkegaard or Heidegger and others that talk about boredom being a non-intentional state in the philosophical sense of the word intentional, and because of that it reveals something very important about the nature of reality, the nature of the self in the philosophical, not in the psychological sense of self. But this is something I've been thinking about and struggling with, and I'd really like to hear if others have thoughts about this. I just don't find it particularly compelling at an intuitive or phenomenological level as a psychologist to say that boredom is a non-intentional state in the philosophical sense of the word. And I really would love to hear if others have any thoughts about that.
Andreas, feel free to just answer.
Yeah, thanks. I'll let Abel talk, and then I can come back and talk about more about the intentional question, because I also think it's fascinating, and maybe we need more clarity there, but I'll pause.
Well, thank you, Andreas. I was going to say you could talk a little bit more. This is part of what I was trying to discuss, and some others at the beginning, John, the intentionality. If quite often we do talk about objects, people, experiences that bore us, or that produce boredom in us. But maybe this is a way of cheating, and rather than answering your question, John, the question is when we say we are bored, whether it's about nothing or there is no intentionality, I probably will also doubt about you. But I was going to send back the question to you. When you said, John, you doubt about that, do you have any hypothesis to feel the target or the intention there, or the boredom in general? Or maybe, Andreas, you were about to say something about this. So in the particular case, I think we can talk about boredom about something. In the general case, it will be more difficult. But I will be also probably willing to say that maybe yes. Anyway, sorry, Andreas, you probably have something to say.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Abel, and I was thinking about it in your talk when you had about, you had that distinction between different ways of talking about boredom. So that's suggestive of what it might be about and what its object is. I mean, I take it intuitive, like it has an object. We're bored with specific things, but I wonder if other people think, and that leads me to place it more into the emotion category than a mood. But at the same time, that doesn't exclude that there might be another form of boredom that is just more free-floating, more long-term, and perhaps even has a much broader intentional scope. I can, but maybe when I talk about that, maybe I'm just describing depression or something else. So that's where I'm not quite clear where to go. So when people, when discussions of ennui, historical discussions of ennui, they're life boredom. They're bored with everything. There's just something there that socially doesn't allow people to, or it's just the description of boredom, the scope is very broad. So I think, a lot of ways that we talk about boredom requires a specific intentional object, but that might not exclude the possibility of this broader account.
Yes, Tom?
Hi. Abel, you were talking about hotel rooms, and something that came to me, and I hope it doesn't sound ridiculous, is that are hotel rooms designed to be boring in order to compel you to leave them? You think of hotel rooms as being something that are, more, a repository of your things rather than your thoughts. Places where you're, kind of briefly living while you're kind of being compelled to get outside, to see the city you're in, or to see and explore the places that you happen to be. Do you think that there is an intentional design? I would guess that there's a design to be somewhat familiar, to be somewhat, a commodification or a similar setup in hotel rooms. But can something be designed to be almost uninhabitable, to push you out, to get you to move forward, if that makes sense?
Thank you, Todd. I think you are right. I think this is what they're designed for, but that doesn't seem to fit in the intentions of the hotel people. They should want us to return. They should want us, even if you're going to be out there in the city, they should offer us, but they fail miserably. They give us shoe boxes where you can survive. They give a table that is not a table, a bed that is not a bed, a chair that is not a chair. and out of that you construct your life. But then we also complete the story by telling ourselves that no, we were not very comfortable because it was not our home. No, because you cannot lead a normal life. And by normal, I don't mean anything spectacular. You cannot sit and watch television on a chair, that you cannot stand up and take 2 steps without crashing against another wall and so on. But if the explanation is what you are proposing, Todd, I think you are very right. That seems to me a little bit that goes against the rules of the market, that if you have a business is to help the others, the museum people, rather than, but to me, to be honest, the contrast, Todd, when I discovered, and I discovered it relatively late, the possibility of the apartment with charm, the apartment with habitability, it was a completely different experience, to the point that I was going to conferences and I didn't want to go to the conference. I wanted to stay in my apartment. I wanted to live a different type of set of possibilities. But I think you are right, Todd.
If I may say something, I think that it's slightly more complicated than that. And I think that the history of architecture helps us to understand that. For example, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this intention to create blank buildings, like blank canvases, because the idea was that the built environment was supposed to be this sort of provocation, was supposed to be neutral. That was supposed to be a contribution to the good life. But then later, postmodernism came, and then it was deemed as boring. And now there's a huge set of researchers, historians, theorists, who are going back to that blankness, to that intentional design of simplicity and repetition, and try to understand why and its effects. But it is now interesting. It's no longer boring. So it's a situation that is it's less one-way street. It's slightly more circular. It begins being boring, then becomes interesting, then it's boring again, and so on and so forth. So it's once again, it's a relationship, but it's also a historical relationship.
Can I reply to Christian? I don't know if anybody. But Christian, okay, from the point of view of the architect, that's part of the story. Now, you and me occupying spaces. I've been thinking about this also. If we complain about the spaces of the hotel rooms, okay, we have the imagination. We can create our possibilities. But the truth is that we cannot. We are good at identifying spaces that we want to occupy, that we prefer. But we are not good at imagining the space, and much less at living the space that we imagine. I can be in a hotel room imagining a chimney, but I do not have a chimney. So this is not, in this case, and this is, I think, very interesting what you're saying, because architects, I think, they're giving us also that. Okay, here it is. You feel it. But we, and I'm talking you and me, are not good at doing that. And I think here the responsibility needs to go back to the architect. They don't need to give us all the possibilities. But insofar as they're humans, they can give us much more. And of course, I'm talking here about the average apartment, the average space, public space, main square, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I think the imagination is crucial for us to enjoy spaces. We do not need to have the physical variation, but we need to have something to leave the space. The imagination doesn't feel it. So I enjoy more living on the lower floor, knowing that there is a terrace above me, even if I'm not occupying the terrace. It affects how I perceive myself. But the terrace is there. Sorry, Christian, I don't know if I'm following up on what you said.
The architecture battles. I see. This is a hot topic right now. And I'm looking forward to your paper, Abel, to read your ideas, which was what thought-provoking. Okay, we have another question that was unanswered to Wijnand, I suppose. I have read something about the potential of endurance of boredom is a key for future success. What do you think about this, especially during pandemics, Wijnand?
So I probably will say in advance, I'm not sure about the answer to this question. I guess it would be empirically tested to give a clear answer. But there it seems that there are individual differences in, for example, how well people can deal with boring situations, right? So if people are placed in boring situations, not everyone gets equally bored, and some people may not get bored at all. I think there's some work that shows that you can become better at coping with boredom, but whether that's a good thing or bad, I'm not so sure. So it reminds me of a related question that I often get when I give interviews, and it's either one of two forms. Either the interviewer asks, so with all this technology now, do you think that we never get bored? Right? Boredom has disappeared, and that's presumably bad. Or we get exactly the opposite, and it is, with all this technology now, we're incapable of dealing with boredom. So we're getting bored all the time, and that's also presumably bad. But whatever it is, technology is bad in this context. And I think this is an important open question that to some degree, history will tell a little bit. The COVID pandemic definitely has caused a lot of boredom. It seems, based on some data that we have, that boredom was particularly heavy at the start, that people have gotten less bored, presumably because they're better prepared or they know how to deal with it better. But I think this is ultimately an empirical question. Anecdotally, I know that I was at a conference on curiosity and boredom at Columbia University a while ago, and there was one PhD student who studied curiosity, I think, among great apes. And he had an interesting hobby. He would, I forgot his name, so apologies, I don't think he's here. What he would do is he would take these long train trips, and he would book a seat, not bring a book at all, nothing to do, and challenge himself to do for as long as possible absolutely nothing. Not meditation or anything, but just try to be bored for 2 hours. He said that he was getting very, very good at doing that, and that he could just endure that for long periods of time, which at least anecdotally suggests that it's definitely possible. Whether it's a route to success, or that that some sensitivity to boredom is actually helpful in order to get out of situations where you might be trapped as an alternative, is I think still somewhat of an empirical question. I suspect John also has some ideas about that, but maybe he wants to weigh in too, especially from a coping perspective, perhaps. I don't know.
Oh, John, please.
Yeah, well, indeed, there's a lot that could be said. I don't want to speak too long. I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this too. But just on that last point, there's a paper by De Vries actually where he does that very experiment for himself, where he tries to immerse himself in boredom and then emerge out the other side and to see what comes of it. And this speaks a little bit to what Marius was referring to earlier as boredom as a transitional state, or boredom as a liminal state, or an in-between state. And, you can go back to Schopenhauer, who talked about, we have a desire, and then if that desire is quickly fulfilled, we have happiness. If we have a desire and that desire is thwarted or blocked, then we have pain and frustration. But if we fulfill a desire and don't have a new desire yet emerging on the horizon, we are bored, right? And so it's that breakdown in the cycling. So, I think boredom, when it is operating well, is brief, and indeed maybe is a transitional state. But I think when we notice boredom, it's because we're not transitioning, right? We're not moving, we're not shifting. And then I think there's lots of interesting questions about why people get stuck in what should be, whatever exactly that means in a functional sense, kind of a more transitional space. Anyway, there's so much to say about this, and I don't want to monopolize, so I'm going to stop talking and love to hear other people's ideas about it.
We have Angie. Angie was first and Todd second.
I suppose just looking at the question, and I suppose one of the questions would also be, what is success in that particular situation? So if I think about success as, say, for example, getting a good job, you could argue that a lot of jobs require you to endure boredom in a lot of different ways. So being a researcher can be extremely boring if you have to, you know, what was that, format a lot of references or something like that. So I suppose maybe the question is also, and I think that also comes up in a lot of educational contexts, you know, like whether people are sort of maybe trained to sort of put up with bad or boring situations. So I think that that idea of like what is success and what does that really mean, you know, definitely plays also a role in a question like that, I would say.
Thank you. I'm a sociologist for this too. What does it mean, a success? You mean work? So maybe we have a lot of researchers on boredom at work. So maybe we should include boredom in training, so how to survive boredom, how to cope with boredom. And if you go with this, what Keith Walker said about the middle class children at schools. They know that they must learn how to endure boredom, and then will be success. Yeah, this will be reward for all these boredom at schools, universities, and junkie jobs before this major occupational success. Mm-hmm. And Todd, please.
I'm kind of jumping off of what you just said there and about children. I know that, and this is, you know, kind of speaking as a father and seeing here, you know, in New York, a number of suicides of young people who would be more technologically advanced. You would think would have that kind of technology, that those outlets for entertainment. But do you think that with age, we become more inured to boredom? It's something that is so poignant and pressing to someone who's young. That seems endless. Do you think that with age, we kind of develop a way of consoling ourselves by saying, well, I'm bored now, but I probably won't be in an hour or a day, but that there is an age sensitivity to how strong it feels, how sharp that edge is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I suppose John Eastwood has a whole chapter about boredom and age, yeah, about this. And Wijnand, you want to say?
Yeah, no. So generally, the younger people tend to report that they're more bored, right, more frequently. But I think one of the issues in a lot of boredom research is that we typically, you know, in the empirical studies, we typically focus on relatively young populations, and there was one talk that talked to us about boredom and older people, and I think it's very important to recognize that among the elderly, for example, there may be very few or lots. They may be much limited in the amount of options they have to deal with it, and I personally suspect that this is a vastly underestimated problem. Where you know, especially people who are in nursing homes or who need assistance in taking care of themselves or so, there's almost an assumption that if you're able to live, right, that ought to be enough, right? The boredom is kind of seen as a luxury problem, and I very much doubt that it is experienced like that. So while boredom seems to be more prominent among young people, I do not think it's necessarily less of a problem among the older generations.
Yes, John, please.
Yeah, just say very quickly that indeed, just following up on what Wijnand said, that we know that from about age 10 to age 18, 20, boredom levels increase. They drop into midlife, and there's a little bit of research that they can climb again at the end of life, as Wijnand is saying, but there's much less research on the elderly, and we can speculate about issues about cognitive capacity, that at these different stages of life, we can think about constraint, we can think about you know, loneliness, we can think about a lot of reasons about why there might be this inverted U function. lots of work still needs to be done. I find it notable that this function is sort of the opposite of kind of like the midlife crisis, where we know that in general, this increased dysphoria or sort of negative mood increases in midlife at the very time when boredom levels are at their lowest. I don't know what to make of that, but that's a kind of an interesting kind of observation. So I would agree with Wijnand that you know, it's a little bit of, we have a lot of data about a smaller subgroup of the population, and we certainly need to look closely at groups like the elderly that we have much less work on.
Thank you. Or maybe this endurance of boredom is just perseverance. And we just should wait, yeah, until we are older and more prepared for this. Okay, we have another question. It was to John Eastwood. Arturo Contujo said that I'm currently working on theories of solipsism in Melville from a phenomenological perspective and found your talk illuminating in many ways. I love Tolstoy's definition of boredom as a desire for desires and wonder how this circular logic might give us a clue about the lived experience of boredom. Do we have a body when bored, or are we a body?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I fully appreciate all the nuances of it. So if Arturo is here, I'd love to hear more. I guess my immediate thought is that when we are bored, we're failing to be agentic. We have become objectified in our own mind and perhaps by our immediate environment. And we become a problem for ourselves. And so if I understand this question correctly, I would say that when we're bored, we are a body, and we have ceased to inhabit and live through our body as an agent.
So this is connected to these philosophical states like in mystics, or we had something like this at the conference.
Well, so I think they're you're talking about in sort of a mystic kind of liberation from the self. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
I would say that, you know, that in a sense, I understand that from a psychological point of view as being similar to the state of flow with respect to the sense of self, in that you're now liberated from the self, and so in a mystical state, I don't think you are experiencing yourself as a problematic body that is inert and not engaged with the world. So I wouldn't say that if we are a body, then we're in a mystical kind of state. But so I don't quite see that connection. But again, I'm not sure that I appreciate all the subtlety in Arturo's question here.
Andreas wanted to say something.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I don't have it. No, I don't know. I just wanted to build upon the Arturo's question, and then maybe, I mean, I find fascinating talk about agency in boredom, but it does seem that we are still agents in some sense. So it's hard to. I wonder if people have thoughts about what's missing. What makes us less of an agent, if we may speak in that way, when we're bored? I mean, is it an inability to clearly articulate what we want to be doing? Is it an ability to initiate that kind of motion? I mean, being struggling in a situation, that seems to be a form of agency in some way. I mean, maybe, but are we? And I'm just wondering about how can we set kind of normative criteria and saying, yeah, you're a good agent or a successful agent or an efficacious agent in this way, and boredom makes it harder to fulfill those criteria. I don't know if that makes sense. It's just a way I'm struggling a little bit of getting clarity about what is the type of agency that we're missing. I don't know if that makes sense, John.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a great question, and maybe it becomes a little too technical to get in. But you were reading the chapter that I wrote for your book, and I would try to link it in Frankfurt's notion about this idea about you're not able to bring your first order desires in line with that second order desired state, and so that's what I would say is missing. And I guess to put it just sort of less technically or more locally, your first answer, I guess, is what I'd give, is that we're not able to articulate what it is that we would like to do in this moment that is doable, and that would be what I mean. But there is a struggle, and so in a sense there is still an agent, because you're not happy about the situation, you're struggling. So I take your point, and it certainly is not this kind of all or none, and work does need to be done, I think, to define this more precisely. I don't know, does that resonate, or does that address your thought?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just raising, I'm struggling myself. And it was prompted by this question about having a body, or feeling that you're having a body. And it certainly feels like my body is more burdensome in some ways. I don't know what the exact way of characterizing it, but I feel like I have to do something with my body. I'm embodied in my boredom. And so I was prompted by that. And that just feels something that agents do, but perhaps not in some other way that we want agents to be acting or be embodied. The contrast with flow is very useful, right? I mean, we clearly were not in a state of flow when we're bored, but yeah, I was just thinking out loud in some ways. So I didn't want to mess things up or overcomplicate it. I think it's an important point, and it was prompted by Arturo's, I think, this kind of metaphorical language, but it's very useful to see in what ways we might be embodied in boredom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this embodiment of boredom would be the major point for our next discussions when we go to our researches, our spaces of reflection, and we go maybe with some ideas about this. And the second thought is about the role of agency. Yeah, that maybe this should be also reflected in the research. Yeah, that maybe this is a cause, but maybe we have some agency when feeling bored, and maybe this is the key to fight with forced kinds of boredom. Yeah, when we have this feeling of agency. Mm-hmm. Yes. I suppose we don't have the presenter here, or do we want to talk about these aesthetics of boredom that artists intentionally want to bore the audience? Yeah, this is something that is connected to avant-garde, or maybe this is also in popular culture, because intuitively, yeah, we can say that capitalism is not about boredom. If you are bored, you are not enjoy this what you consume, but maybe this is somehow useful. Mm-hmm. Annie, please.
I suppose I was thinking about exactly that connection when Pavel and Marta were doing their presentation this morning about video games or computer games having that ability to bore people, and whether they need to sort of supply a meaning that is intrinsic in the game in order to be not boring, or whether it's about people finding meaning within them in order to be engaged. And I suppose a lot of these type of avant-garde art do exactly that. They don't necessarily supply intrinsic meaning, but it is about people looking at it and finding their own meaning potentially. That is kind of not something that the artist has supplied directly. So I think probably the games we were talking about this morning are definitely an example of the popular culture doing something very similar, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So then they have this intention, yeah, to make people bored. Mm-hmm. And Anna Pohmara, please.
Right. So it was my question, and it was answered in the chat that although that kind of aesthetics is predominantly found in avant-garde products, it can be also found in popular culture in the process of sort of trickling down from the avant-garde. This is the phrase that was used, and they can somehow work in the same way to a lesser extent, right? So like watered down sort of. And so two things that I would add to the answer. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the speaker. Is that when I think about popular culture in recent years, something that many people watched was the last season of Twin Peaks. So it is to some extent a cultural product distributed via this mainstream platform, and yet there was one episode that had basically no narrative, and in a way was very similar to the cinematic aesthetics discussed in the paper. And secondly, what we talked about after Abel's paper today, I think, the paper was great, and it made me think that that kind of boring aesthetics in the cinema is not necessarily boring if it stimulates you in that kind of way, and if it excites you. So, right. So that would be it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we can have this paradox that maybe something boring is engaging, or something that was meant to be boring, yeah, to be precise, yeah, make out to be engaging. Mm-hmm. And we have John D'Amico, who wants to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much. The discussion kind of reminds me of a quote actually from, I think it was Susan Sontag, who said that with regard to new forms of art, that it isn't so much that the artist themselves wants to intentionally bore people, but that the public who is attending to the art, since it's such a new form, they don't have the structures really of attention in the mind to perceive that which is interesting in the art. And so there's this inability to sort of perceive or register that which might be interesting in this new creation. And I think of a really funny example about the reception of Proust's In Search of Lost Time. At the very beginning, one of the critics from, I think it was one of the big presses at the time, wrote, "I don't know how a man can spend 30 pages writing about how he's rolling around in bed for, because the beginning of the novel is about how he's trying to find himself after sleeping and figuring out who he is." And so, of course, readers thought that that 30-page description of, the eye of In Search of Lost Time, how that might be boring. But then, of course, now we see that as, oh, it's, the great example of French modernist literature. But before it became, codified as that, it was seen as boring. So I think that's kind of a thing too. The novelty at first, you can't really perceive what's interesting about it because it's so new, and there's this kind of feeling of it being boring. So.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of Goncharov's Oblomov, who has in his bed for the 1/3 of the novel, trying to do something with his day, not meaning life even. So maybe there is a method in this boringness. I don't know how to name it. Okay, once again, Anna Pohmara. Or this is the previous hand? Okay, maybe this is the previously raised hand. Okay, do we have another question? Okay, there is there is a question from Michael Gardiner to Andreas about these questions connected to poverty, that poverty causes boredom. There are only collective solutions, which means transformative social change, and ways to spread this would be things like stronger workers' rights, universal basic income, and or universal basic services, more public housing, increased public participation in policy and governance. Yeah, this was more of the comment, but the issue is, yeah, maybe there is some connection between basic income and boredom, and what would it be? Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and as I was mentioning yesterday, feels like a week ago. Yesterday, this is, I'm scratching the surface, and I work on boredom. I consider this to be we're all in this together. So I do a little bit of here, and then somebody else does a little bit there, and so collectively, hopefully, we can progress our conversation. So I'm scratching the surface and trying to understand what I mentioned yesterday perhaps would be called kind of symptomatic social boredom, or the intersection between the personal level and the social level. But of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We can keep going and understanding the systemic, cultural, historical factors that give rise to that. And yeah, I agree. I mean, this, if anything is going to change, it's going to be we need systemic changes. And just to touch upon this idea of basic income and boredom, and I mentioned this very briefly yesterday. I mean, I don't know what you all think about the notion of bullshit jobs, but one of the suggestions by Graeber was how to deal with bullshit job was to incorporate, or was ultimately an argument for basic income or universal basic services of some sort. And so if there is a close relationship between meaninglessness and bullshit job, which seems there is, and if there's a close relationship between meaninglessness and boredom, then that might be another, perhaps a more roundabout way of thinking of the relationship between basic income and boredom. But those are just a couple of basic thoughts on these topics.
Because I suppose that there are two points. Directly, and this is the opposite point. So one thing that it is against the basic income, because people would be bored if they don't have to work because of this basic income. And another point, opposite point, is that now people are bored at work. So to prevent this, we should go with this basic income, because those people who would benefit most from basic income are those who has these bullshit jobs, this low prestige and high in boredom jobs. Annie, please.
I think I would almost argue that the first option that you said, that people might get more bored, seems almost more or less likely, I think, because I suppose the idea of basic universal income is that a lot of people will still be working because it only provides sort of a base level that allows people to survive and then basically do what they really want to be doing. And I think we can probably sort of rely on that idea that a lot of people will abandon jobs that are just unhealthy, not giving them what they want to be doing, and instead do something that is meaningful to them. So I don't see that necessarily that connection between that universal basic income will increase boredom. I think there's also maybe a connection between automation and how that maybe plays into the development of jobs in the future in general. What kind of jobs are more likely to be taken over by automation, which obviously at the beginning were more the repetitive and easy jobs. Nowadays, if you look at the development sort of in medicine, for example, there are a lot of really very complicated jobs that are maybe being taken over by artificial intelligence, also researchers. So I think that's another thing maybe to think about, you know, where basic income comes in this whole discussion, and where the boredom fits in. But yeah, that's another topic altogether.
Yeah, thank you. I just said that there are 2 points who I'm aware of in this discussion about boredom and basic income. And Michael, want to join?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said around universal basic income, and a lot of the devil is in the details. I mean, how it's implemented, how it relates to other social programs, and so on and so forth. But I was thinking of Peter Fleming's idea that the idea of kind of full employment is basically a political question, because economically it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. It's about sort of keeping people distracted at work and concentrating on work and under kind of market discipline and keeping tabs on them. I mean, you know, where people live if they're employed. And so one of the ideas of basic income is to free them from the kind of market discipline and to give them the time to like think about other possibilities. So it's really about the politics of time. A lot of work now is bullshit work. It's just designed to keep people concentrated on kind of meaningless tasks and out of trouble, right? But we want people to be in trouble. I mean, we want people to question their circumstances and their, you know, social conditions. And so a basic income, I think, is seen as a kind of revolutionary reform. In and of itself, it's not necessarily revolutionary, but it can create, you know, different social conditions that allow people to criticize and think about, you know, their surroundings and give them the time to do so. That's really what it's about. So anyway, thanks.
Thank you, Michael. And we have another hand raised by Marta or Pavel.
Yeah, that's me again. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree with what Professor Gardiner has just said. I just wanted to add that there seems to be, I guess, in general, some confusion around what the phrase full employment is supposed to mean. Traditionally, and also from a more, say, Marxist perspective, this does not mean that everyone has to perform a job. It only means that all the willing people have employment. And well, from a Marxist viewpoint, this has to do with, let's say, the reduction or the abolishment of the so-called reserve army of labor. So UBI, according to most UBI proponents, would actually introduce full employment in this sort of a broader sense, right? So we don't need to work all the time, every moment of our lives. It's not that we all need to have stable employment. It's that there are no unwilling, unemployed people out there. Sorry if that was a bit chaotic.
Thank you for this comment. Yeah, so there's a lot to be done here, and John Eastwood want to add something.
Yeah, I just want to say really quickly that I think, you know, addressing labor and housing and all of these things is an end in itself. It's a good, and I think that it would be relevant for helping people with boredom. And so these are great things to consider. I think that there's still going to be the need to participate meaningfully in one's life, and of course that's going to be easier to do if these things are addressed. But I don't think these things will necessarily ensure that people will not experience boredom. And I think it's, you know, it's all very complicated, so that if there are social causes of boredom, I think we still can have individual responses as well as collective responses. And I hope that we don't go too far and start to see this as an either or kind of question.
So what we need is the social reform and maybe some experiment, maybe on a social scale. Yeah, and then we figure out, yeah, we are boredom researchers. So then we go to this country or state and do research about this. Okay, we have another hand.
Yeah, sorry, that was me. I just wanted to follow up on John's point, which is a good one. And I didn't want to imply by this comment that it's a top-down technocratic thing. You know, that's the old welfare state that I think we want to get away from. I think, you know, there are statist solutions to some extent, but we also need much broader popular participation in policy formation, in engagement with, you know, dealing with, you know, social problems at the local level and so on and so forth. So I think it can be top down and bottom up at the same time, and I think we need both of those. So yeah, I didn't want to apply a kind of, you know, technocratic approach to social problems at all. So yeah.
Yeah, because in this approach, it would be boring, like any kind of utopian projects that were forced onto people. Yeah, if they choose to be engaged in this project, yeah, we have kibbutz and many other attempts. Yeah, and we see that the first generation was pretty well, more or less. Yeah, but the second generation, there's a problem. Yeah, because they were socialized in this environment, so they don't have actual choice for this. So there is a lot to be done, I suppose, and I think that this is a interesting path to follow. Maybe not only for sociologists, maybe for others as well. Okay, and new questions. And the first new question I'd like to ask our keynote speakers. Yeah, because we have these boredom studies from since several years. Now we have a society. So how you, as a leading experts in the field, in the newly founded field, maybe, see the future of boredom studies? What should be done? What do you think about the future of this enterprise like boredom studies? So please join the discussion in the order you'd like. John, Andreas, Wijnand, and Michael.
Yeah, you know who are the leaders.
So Michael is the first, please.
Yeah, I'll throw my hat in the ring, albeit reluctantly. Yeah, it was something I was thinking about in my climate talk, and I was thinking about how we can think about boredom as a political issue more kind of overtly. And one of the things I uncovered in my research about climate change, I didn't talk about it in my talk, is that the term climate change itself, it dates from the 70s, but it was actually popularized in the 1990s. And that's because a Republican Party strategist and climate skeptic decided to weaponize the term and make it sort of a popular phrase to replace the earlier and much more accurate term global warming. And the whole point of using the phrase climate change was to make it very boring. Like, climate change, what's wrong with change? You know, it's a non-issue, it's a neutral expression. So maybe we should think more about how you know, certain agencies weaponize boredom as a political tool, and maybe this is something we might think about.
Yes, please, Wijnand.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, I think this is this brings up an important point. And so for the last few decades, there are lots of papers in psychology where that start with something like boredom has been trivialized in the last years. I myself do it all the time, and I think I've been criticized for doing this by some reviewers. And rightfully so, because in psychology, it's no longer a trivial issue. However, I think it's still seen as a bit of a triviality outside of this domain, right? It's a silly topic in a way, in people's perspectives often. And I think and this is quite clear when talking about climate change, dismissing it as a boring topic or so shows that sort of trivial status that it has. And I think and in some contexts, boredom will be trivial, not in climate change, but in some other contexts. But I think it's important that as academics working with this, we emphasize to the public that there are particular contexts where boredom is really an issue, right? Amongst the elderly, amongst refugees, amongst people who are living rough, for example, these kind of situations, amongst students in schools, that it's not just a luxury problem, but that it has, especially on long term, some pretty nasty consequences. So, well, maybe now, at least in psychology, we're quite content that we have reached the spotlight with boredom research. There's still a whole society to be shown how relevant boredom is. And of course, aside from just understanding what boredom does, it is also our role as academics to communicate that effectively to this wider world. So I see there the important role of boredom studies to reach out more and go beyond boredom leads to creativity. These are the kind of stories where people may be bored and they start snacking. These are all important, but there are bigger implications that we may want to communicate.
Mm-hmm. So you suggest that boredom studies should launch the social campaign, maybe something like this, yeah, on the relevance of boredom, yeah. So we should fight with journalists.
Not fight, no fight. They're there to help us, and my experience is they really want to help us, but they don't speak our language in terms of how we study it and how, you know, what the findings are, and that's on us, right? Or in part, we're the ones who have some control over that. So we should really, I think, do our best to communicate that as effectively as possible.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is a highly valid point. And Michael, want to add something?
Yeah, I really appreciate Wijnand's points there. But in another sense, it's out of our hands. Like, we can communicate with journalists and so on and try to make a case that boredom studies is a real thing and that these are serious social issues associated with boredom and so on and so forth. But there's a wider problem. I'm not complaining, but a lot of times when academic work on boredom is reviewed in the popular literature, it is still a kind of laughingstock. It's still seen as a sort of joke thing, a niche, you know, fringe interest that is laughable in a way. I'm thinking of things in the New Yorker and other things that have, you know, covered academic work on boredom. And in a way, I'm going, it's nice to have attention from these mainstream publications, but in another sense, why are they reviewing academic work? It's clearly not their thing, right? So I have ambivalent feelings about this. Yeah, we want to sell this to a wider public, but on the other hand, not to be trivialized or sort of laughed at the same time. Again, this sounds like complaining and whining, but I don't want to make it sound that way. But it is an issue.
Thank you, Michael. So maybe we should also educate our colleagues about the relevance of boredom. Okay, John Eastwood, please.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a great question and one that I think we have to meditate on for some time. I really think that this group of people, this conference, is playing an important role with respect to this question. And I kind of, you know, personally, I enjoy working at the interface between different disciplines, and I kind of believe that there's value in doing that. One of the challenges then, though, becomes around agreement and clarity around terms and use of words. And I think that although the different people doing work in this area have been attentive to try to make sure that we're talking the same language, so to speak, I still think there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. And I think coming up with some definitions or concepts or ways of thinking that we can all agree and get behind from our different perspectives would be very helpful. On the flip side, I also see the value of like kind of very specific disciplinary work on a subject without concern to try to use terms that are consistent with what a philosopher or a sociologist might use, but then having spaces for dialogue. And so I think we need both this kind of shared sandbox and then sandboxes where we have spaces to talk to each other from those sandboxes. And in both cases, we're going to have to come up with language and communication so that we're able to speak to each other effectively. I also think that the boredom studies is still a little theory light. There's still a lot of kind of empirical studies in search of a theory, so to speak. And I think there's a lot of space for some careful theorizing to draw together and to guide the work we do. I think the political, social side has already been named. I won't repeat that. I think that's a great thing to focus on. I think this idea about the tension between boredom as a functional state and boredom as also giving rise to a large number of psychosocial ills is still a tension that hasn't fully been resolved. And, you know, I like others, you know, say, well, boredom has this functional role. And yet then we kind of fumble when we try to talk about how boredom becomes problematic or how it becomes protracted and leads to problems. And so understanding the mechanisms of that and the individual differences within people that lead to some of that bifurcation, I think is a really fruitful area for future inquiry as a particular topic that we might look at. So those are just a few of my thoughts, but I think indeed this is an important question, and I hope this this group can continue to raise these questions and to bring people together to talk about them.
Thank you, John. So, Andreas, this is your turn.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know what the future is. I can't tell that, unfortunately. I'll be betting on the euro right now. But I just want to thank you all for putting the conference, Marius and Josefa, because I've been isolated working on boredom. I know there's exciting work on boredom, and I think we all know that. It's just hard to know where to go to find it. And it's not necessarily that I have to, engage with everything that's written on boredom, because that's just impossible. But it helps my thinking, knowing that, if I start thinking about housing and boredom or architecture and boredom, public spaces and boredom, there's a whole group of people doing amazing work, and I can go find it. So I think what I'm most grateful about for this conference is that it showed to me clearly that, and now I have names too, so I know your names. Sounds weird, but I can look at your work and I can read more about it. And I think that's what was missing from my discipline. And philosophers tend to be very narrowly focused. And unfortunately, there are institutional reasons and sociological reasons why that happens, how our articles are reviewed, how we get for promotion and all that. So those are things that are more systemic. But as someone who wants to learn more, as individuals, knowing everybody and their work, this is just a great gift to me. And I hope to others as well. I want to echo two things before I just stop. I think Wijnand is right, and I felt this, and maybe I'm complaining, but I find often when we talk to journalists, the questions are the same in some way. They want an answer, and if I don't give them the answer, they're not happy with what I just said. And if they ask you, how can you be more creative about boredom, I say, well, it's complicated. They don't like the complicated. And so you're just staying out of the conversation because you're not telling what they want. And I find, there are pressures to publish and to present this aspect. But if I read one more time how boredom makes you more creative, I don't know what I'm going to do. It's just not, this is just, it's been said. And so there are tropes out there that I think might be harming us as people who want to say, it's actually very complicated. Yeah, we might want to say that at some point, but not necessarily all the time. And I don't know what the right solution to that, but I wanted to echo that. And then final thing, and this might be just a personal kind of annoyance or difficulty, and goes back to what John was saying. There's this idea of boredom proneness that's been out for a while now, since the 80s, and before that, using different scales. I don't think we know what the hell that is, theoretically speaking. I don't have a good understanding, but it seems to be very important. It seems to be correlating with other things. And so if we want to move from the state to the more personal, to interpersonal differences, and perhaps to the social, maybe we can all come together and just start thinking about what this life boredom, existential boredom might be, because I clearly don't know what it is. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And we have another hand. Michael wanted to say something, or I was mistaken?
No, I put my hand up quickly. I just wanted to draw attention to turn on the chat function. And I think it's a very important point that is made there, and that is, we don't spend enough time talking about post-colonial contexts. We don't spend enough time talking about boredom and racialized subjects, and so on and so forth. So I just wanted to emphasize that, and that's something for the future of boredom studies that we really do need to address more, enthusiastically.
Yeah, we should publish the chat for all participants, at least. Okay, and now I suppose Isabella Wagner is.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm a little bit not at easy because I don't consider myself as a specialist of boredom, really. And I learn a lot because I know nothing. So thank you very much for your presentations. I have 3 points which are simply related with my specialization. And this is like certainly too much. And the vision, like, very utopian visions. But the first one would be, what about this one panel with people specialized in MRI? I work with geneticians and brain specialists. I did a lot of field work with them, and I know that my sociological question, they frequently even laugh on them, or we spoke about, but for them the responses were completely different because they saw it from the brain function and chemistry. So why just, I'm not sure what will be after that, but they also work on boredom, because when you're looking for Alzheimer and aging, etc., they are looking for that on the brain function. The second point is just Michael said post-colonial, and I'm thinking about anthropologists and what we saw with Marius with these languages, and in Africa, boredom. We had fascinating discussion. What is boredom in some African languages? How other cultures will perceive it? Because up till today, I see that like very ethnocentric, which is normal. But we need to open up, we need to know and to learn from others. And third, and that will be my first study, artists. We need some artists, and here people, you mentioned John Cage, but other people, visual artists, we are close with architecture, and with amazing talk that we had today. And you saw how it was inspiring, how animated discussion, this presentations provoke. But I think that artists, so we need to perhaps before the next conference ask some people from these areas if they would be interested in. Thank you very much, and congratulations to organizers. It was really very, very good place to be. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I suppose that this is the good point, that we should reach out the different specialities, not only ours, specialists. Okay, and John Eastwood had the hand, I suppose.
Oh, I think, yeah, I didn't really have much to say. I just impulsively put it up when Andreas was speaking about the media. You know, I had to do a lot of media stuff the last little while with the book, and I just wanted to say that the other issue is not just that they won't talk to you, but that they'll misquote you horribly, you know, even with quotation marks, as if this is what I said. No, that's not what I said. So, you know, there is some challenge there, but anyway, that's all I wanted to say. And certainly, I totally agree that we need to understand boredom proneness in particular, and I had that in the back of my mind when I was thinking about our need for more theory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And we should be ending this discussion. So the last question from Todd, or question or comment.
Just a quick comment. Having been a journalist, it's such a broad field. There is of course specialization within it, sports journalism, literary critics, but it seems, and part of why I've gone back to school and working on the master's, is that you're required to be almost a jack of all trades. If you think about the big stories that are happening in the US right now, the UFO report coming out, there's Britney Spears testimony. You're trying to appeal to a denominator that doesn't have perhaps an understanding, and you're trying to generate an interest. And it becomes very difficult in a lot of ways to work through that. Going back to school, instead of being a jack of all trades, I'm trying to be a master of two, a joke. But journalism is always going to be, in a lot of ways, something that very much scratches the surface and looks immediately for the nuggets of gold rather than mining more deeply. And so it just seems that the work that everybody's doing here needs to be seen. It just seems innate to journalism that it's going to be twisted for that sparkly quote, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. You're probably right that maybe we should all be a bit interdisciplinary and jacks of all trades here also. Okay, and two last comments. If you are because we are now all. First of all, about publication, Josefa will be sending all of us information about publication after this conference. This will be collected, edited book. Something maybe with boredom studies in the title, but this is in the middle of processing right now. And the second thing is that we will have in 10 minutes presentation of our International Society of Boredom Studies. So please feel invited for this at least short presentation. Yeah, but this is highly important for us to share it with you. Yeah, we are there is 5 of us in this society, and we have some members already, but we want to share it as far as possible. So please stay with us if you can. This won't be long, I suppose, and maybe it is. And we are also curious about your thoughts, about maybe questions, maybe suggestions, what we can do more about this society, what opportunities we can have because of the society. So we want you to share maybe with us also. So now we have at least 8 minutes break. Yeah, and we go with this short but concise presentation.